So we're here for a different kind of videos today with the Art of Puzzlecrafting, where I'm going to talk through how I constructed this TomTom mystery puzzle from a few days ago with a 400 theme for my 400th web puzzle. This is far from my 400th overall puzzle. I've probably written 2,000 plus in my career. It's hard to keep a count, but for web posts in general, we have marked some of these milestones, and also other authors on the site have marked some of these milestones. My first milestone puzzle is likely this one from my old LiveJournal blog. This is now certainly over 10 years old, maybe 15 years old, of Friday puzzle number 100. I used to only post one of these every Friday, and so this is a way, having marked 2 years of doing that. So here is another Motris milestone completing 100 total blog entries. And it had some of my favorite styles. TomTom was in it. It seems TomTom is a common theme, putting 100 in different ways in the grids. It's actually hidden somewhere here across these cipher clues. This was sort of how I'd done it back in my LiveJournal days, and I actually didn't bother to have a second 100th milestone puzzle on the Grandmaster Puzzles. While this is a cool looking puzzle as a black versus white half and half Mashu, nothing about 100 around this puzzle. There's no hidden content here. I just didn't celebrate again. But by the time I got up to 200 puzzles on the web, I did make this interesting construction. This is an example in my prior career of taking an idea I had for a while that I hadn't found a home for yet, but wanting to write it before it lost its freshness. And this was an idea to have kind of a three-dimensional TomTom and some construction. It's going to be a 6x6x6, where I could clue 5 of the grids and have an interesting mystery hunt kind of layer on the last grid. And I just didn't have mystery hunt winning teams around sort of when I had this idea. So didn't find a home for this puzzle, but when I was thinking about a big milestone, this is what I brought back as my first milestone on Grandmaster Puzzle. It's one of my favorite things I've written for the site, and it definitely stands out today as one. If you've not solved, you should go and click through the links to solve. By the time I got to 300, I was still starting around the idea of using TomTom. It's a puzzle genre which got my name on it in part because the other name for this puzzle is trademarked, and so the space of the handcrafting I was doing around TomTom puzzles stood out to me as an interesting way. And I definitely had an idea at that time to take an unknown digits or unknown numbers. I'm going to do this a lot in this video, of changing digits and numbers. But when I say digit, I really mean it allows for a 2 or 3 digit number. So let's just hope I stated numbers or integers for the rest of the time. Take an unknown set, in this case, eight numbers that add up to 300, as well as the value 300. And a spoiler alert ahead, I guess 300 and 0 going in there is like the star of this puzzle. But there's not enough arithmetic richness around 300 that I could specify all the values, except by adding in some of these cages with some different values within it. And in doing so, I still made a really, really interesting puzzle. I also still really love this puzzle, but you can see it was not clean to just using 300. And so there's at least some opportunity, I felt, to pay an homage back to this when I got to writing a 400th post. That's not to say this is where my idea for the 400th post started from, but it's useful to know that this is the most recent one before this one, and it's actually not that different from the one here. But see for sure, I wanted to make sure this was clean to only have 400 in the grid if I actually did this again. But I didn't start from knowing I was going to do that. I started from a different placeholder. When Sircon was asking and I was saying 400 was coming up, we slotted into the calendar, although I had miscounted the Grand Prix puzzle, so my 400 puzzle was not in the literal order of 400. My placeholder was a good / very, very, very bad idea of doing a 20 by 20 puzzle, and that's because 400, like 900, are some of the upcoming 100 values that have a square factor in them, so that just making a larger grid shape can make this work. And why I say this is a very, very bad idea is not all puzzles scale well with size. I think I've mentioned in other places, like I did a 25 by 25 Sudoku once. Those are 5 hours I'll never get back, but I will never, ever, 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 never, ever do a 25 by 25 Sudoku again. It does not scale in an interesting way. It's just a lot more bookkeeping, and it's not a fun experience. And so I didn't want to write something that might not be a fun experience. And so actually thinking through how to make this interesting, particularly if I wanted it to be a TomTom, I ran into a few challenges. I was just sort of sketching out ideas. Like, one thing is I'd probably want, besides just it having 400 cells, to have like a 400 in the grid that I could backshade in gray, and have maybe even like a clue like 400 sitting near these things. And on the arithmetic side, you need at least 21 cells in a 120 puzzle to get a value that's as large as 400. And I don't see many solvers kind of working through and adding up across all those digits, thinking about how 17 and 13 and 20 and 18 and 16 and 16 again and 20 and that you're just not going to do that. And so didn't feel like the addition was interesting. And when you think about the products are pretty limited, particularly in small cage-shaped sizes. Here's a 3x4 cell that works just fine for a 4, and there's another one that works, it would be this shape. But the ones adjacent that are for zeros, there is no 3x4 zero that works. It can be filled. 1, 2, 4, 5 is a minimal set for a column. By the time you get over here and put in 1, 2, and 5, you have a missing value because you've already gotten up to 400. That means 2 cells can't be used. So you can make a 3x3 zero, you can make a 3x4 or 3x3 or other shapes of 4s that product up to 400. But this didn't feel rich enough. For a whole host of reasons, this was a bad idea. But for 2 months, I think this is what Sircon still felt I was going to write. And conceptually was always in the idea space. Another thing is any milestone puzzle can always just have a set of connected grids that, for instance, 4 by 10 by 10 would use 400 cells. And while this was in my thought sphere, Sircon's recent Sunday Stumper I saw before writing this puzzle. I was like, I shouldn't just do this again. But he just wrote a 400 cell puzzle. It was really, really clean. Used the 2022 theme quite well across these positions. And in doing that, coming to this idea didn't feel as rich at this moment, particularly when this works for any n-100th idea. And I guess my threat/promise to this group, I have a goal for this year of getting to 1,000 or more YouTube subscribers on this channel. We're over 600 right now. Is if we get to 1,000, those YouTube subscribers, and it doesn't cost anything, you just got to click the button, we'll get a 10 by 10 by 10 or 10 by 10 grid, some form of that puzzle to celebrate the 1,000th subscribers. So this idea was thrown out, but still a good idea for the future. And this is one of the things when you're puzzle crafting, you write out ideas, some are rich, some are better for later, and keep a list of the ones for later. A thing I've not done in milestone puzzles necessarily, you obviously saw I did a cipher early on. I did not come back to cipher for a tom-tom only, and so one of the ideas in this list was to get to a cipher for a 400 themed tom-tom only puzzle. And I wanted to, in my typical fashion, start to play with the solver's minds in creative ways. And if I had a clue in the grid like ABB, or CBB or DBB, with 2 repeated last digits, I know solvers would think somewhere in this grid he's put 400, and maybe many places he's put 400. And so for this theme to work, I needed to at least have some decoys, which meant I needed a number set that made CDD work, and potentially even things that aren't listed here, like EDD or FDD or further extended sets. And so one thing I did was take about 15 minutes to explore what are values of X, Y, Y that factor nicely into digits that are less than 10. Numbers are less than 10, like 1 through 9 space, or 1 through 8 space, or 1 through 7 space. And 144 and 288 are well known. I've used them in puzzles before. 400, 100, 900, well known, used in some puzzles before. I had missed in that quick exploration if any other values were useful. I'd spent more time on the 55s at the end and saw that 51, which breaks down to a factor of 17, is probably the cleaner one that uses 55. The other numbers that factor nicely, like 21, 81, would actually be 0, 5 after you take out the factor of 5. There's one that I didn't mark, but I found again when I did some computational search after writing out the sheet of paper and making my judgment. So the puzzle that could have been would have used 588, which is somehow 7 squared times 3 times 2 squared, and how that factors. And so this would have been a great partner. 588 with 288 would have given me 2 decoys actually of this shape. So I could get a few that are hundreds, a few that are ending in 88, and then with the potential set of 144 to disambiguate them. There is a way across these 6 values to write a puzzle, but I had a real challenge in thinking to my solvers when I wasn't coming to 588 as some magic number of running into that on their own. And so for various reasons, this is left to the annals of history, or for future solvers to already know that 588 is now on my list of interesting numbers to consider for future puzzles. And so again, future spoiler. I guess I haven't written a puzzle where this is a spoiler, but 588 is now in my mental list to add to these 5 numbers, which have been in my mental list for a long time. But again, something for later, not for this grid today. So I did reluctantly but excitedly say, can I come back to the mystery theme, but can I make 400x and 400 plus be the sole ways this works out? And just as with the 300 puzzle, it starts by writing out some of your constraint spaces. I was for sure going to use a lot of paired 400x clues in 2 cells, and so 1 by 400, all these kind of multiples coming down. There's 7 such multiple pairs. And then there's 20 on its own, which can be squared to make 400, but not easy to use in a tom-tom unless you have 20 times 1 times 20. So this is kind of an oddball that was in the thought sphere. The reason I couldn't make this clean theme work for 300 is that there weren't a lot of ways to actually get the sums to then also get up to that value. But in doing so, to disambiguate different values from each other, where a 400 times in 2 cells doesn't really tell you anything from these list of 14 numbers. you'd have some other ways you start to clue individual things. And so I started by looking at 1 by n cages to just say, are there some unique ways you get to a sum of 400 in those numbers? 200, 100, 80, 20 is the only way in 4 numbers to make that happen. But again, it involves 20, which was not necessarily a digit I wanted to use. And then I went to 1 by 5 and said, what are the 5 plus ways that go? And those still always need to take the 2 largest values besides 400. So 200 and 100 are required, but I ran into 80, and then 20 left over is 16 and 4. If it doesn't take 80, I could take 50 and 40 and 10. And there are no other ways across the set for that to work. So I said, oh, that's curious. It's not defined, but it's fairly defined. It's got just 2 options for it. Those options always use this pair and this pair. They never use this pair. And then in some set A, it takes 580 and 1625. And in some set B, it takes 850 and 1040 as additional sets. So like that could be a seed for a puzzle. I didn't yet have like anything written on paper to say that was the puzzle, but it was a good enough seed. And it wasn't where I stopped this investigation. Like another thing that helps a lot in TomTom puzzles is where you can use small bent cages to also define exact placements of digits. And the most common way this works is when one value will be doubled and a second value goes with it. A 3-cell bent cage is uniquely actually given in any digit space here, or number space here, 100, 100, 200. There's actually no way 3 distinct digits work in this mode. In a product space, there are lots of ways 3 distinct digits work, like 2 times 4 times 50, all these sort of other options are there, but there are ways within a grid, once you have some number specified, to probably force a duplication. And so if I could force like a 2 somewhere in an LX cage, could I make it be 2, 2, 100, or 4, 4, 25, or 5, 5, 16, or 10, 10, 4, 20, 21? That's a way I could suddenly like place a 25 in the grid or a 16 in the grid if I hadn't placed them before. And these would be values that matter just in sort of digit space A for the grid. 2 times 100 times 2 is true in both A or B. 4, 10, 10 is just true in the B space. And I was pretty convinced by this point I didn't want to have 20s in my puzzle, so I wasn't going to be able to use this. And so I don't have to care about 20 times 1 times 20. So I had the idea this is going to be something like an 8 by 8 grid, 4 pairs that multiply to 400, and can I now use some of these sum constraints like this sum constraint to get something to work out. So that's all work that preceded me starting to actually get a grid in front of me to try to write this puzzle. But the rest of this video, and I know this is already going long, but figured we'd go overboard for the first time I do one of these, is shown here. So this is me filming me trying to construct this puzzle, and from the stuff I'd already talked about, you'll be familiar with the starting seed, like the top row or some row is going to be 400x cages. So I started by that on grid paper, then drew out my whole 8 by 8 grid, and I should be faster doing this by now, but I kind of like I'm slowly counting. I'm marking my midpoints on both sides. I don't bother to try to mark all of the 2 by 2 cells in doing this, but I knew I was also going to be using a 400 plus shape and getting to a spot like this. And I guess I'll change back my playback speed a little bit while going through this, but at least wanted to highlight here I knew I was going to have 3 leftover digits, and I also was thinking visually I might want them to wrap around the edges of the grid. So a way that would work, given I'm going to have some leftovers, is to figure out, can I get a unique way they split 1 versus 2, that something about those 2 cells works together coming up the grid. So you'll see I'm drawing in this kind of like vertical L shape, and I eventually want this to be 4 cells or larger, in part because there are a ton of ways that you get 3 cells together to work as a product, but I figured there was some set of ways across all these values to make the set that would sort of work together as values. So I'll sort of come to this point and sort of play forward from here. I've got the leftover digits, which are 2, 4, 8 or 2, 5, 25 across those different 8 number break aparts that have a sum that gets to 400 plus. And what I'm thinking through is there any unique way that I get sort of a remaining product to work out in 2 or more cells? And for instance, 8, 16, 32 are the only ways I get a product of those values across 2, 4, and 8. And the value that has 50 at the top, we need to get a 50 in either one cell, which is straight away easy, and actually others of these would work out. But if it's in 2 cells, there is no way to get 50 in the product of 2 of these numbers, 2 by 25, 4 times 12.5, that seems crazy, 8 times a number smaller than 8. You can pretty quickly rule out 50. You can just as easily rule out 25. 16, we need 25 left over, but there's no factor of 5. The smallest thing with a factor of 5 in is 10, so 16 is no good, 32 is no good. So there's no way to have a 4-cell cage that uses a 2, 4, 8 pair. I wasn't yet convinced that I wanted to make this be the break-in for the puzzle, but I was at least allowing myself to use something like this as a potential break-in. one of the things when you're writing any puzzles, you can always make the puzzle easier later on by using additional traits that will further constrain. Like a solver may not know the constraint space yet, but I did want to at least consider if there's something interesting about the constraint space here. So I then went to the other side, 2, 5, 25 as 10, 50, and 125 in the shared products. 125 doesn't work at all for 2 cells because you'd have to have 2 times 2. 10 doesn't work because 40 left over doesn't split here, but 2 and 25 into 50 works really, really nicely. 2 and 25 leaves behind a product of 8, which is exactly 2 and 4. And so there is a unique breakdown. If these were the only clues right now in this puzzle, that would let the solvers potentially find there's a 2, 4 that eliminates the 2 in the 8th column in the bottommost row to put 2 to the left, 25 to the right. And that could be the break-in for anyone in their puzzles. I actually don't know if that's the break-in persona we'll use in our solving video here. There are definitely other routes to it, but this is one way the solvers could have found it, is the same way when I was just constructing this puzzle from the start, how I made my bottom row work out. Now, like knowing I've got my digit set, I hadn't entered this actually knowing it would be the 248 versus a 2525. It now for sure is a 2525. So I'm writing out some of the things that matter. Again, these sort of the product crooks on the 100, 200, 100 was true in any form of the world. 2, 4, 5, 16, 25, 80, 100, 200 were now like numbers I was trying to keep in my head a lot. Knowing the full sum of that set, which do it again, or actually I wrote it out. 432 looks right to me, at least from my ability to consider this now. And so that actually means that 32 is what's lost in any column, and that's typically, is as seen here, like 2, 4, 5, 25. And actually at the start of the puzzle, after you have the 2, 4, 25 marked, you have 401. Sorry, you have you have 401 left in that column, so you have to have a digit that's one smaller in that extra cell than that. So I could put in a crook to make this 4, 5, forcing the 5, forcing the 80 shape go. And again, here I'm trying to construct the puzzle sort of like I'm also solving the puzzle. I'm just trying to figure out some things that are now constrained, not necessarily where I was looking, but some act of like writing like I'm solving is how you'll see me go back and forth between my normal form of video. Here I'll sort of pause, and so having marked some of the right side, the left side has the forced leftover digit of 5, and I figured, well, let's keep using these small paired sets, and let's try to build a full frame around the outside. And maybe I'm still making a frame theme here. Like there is still a space and way I could have had just like another box and still a clean visual shape for the grid. The visual elegance of the puzzle was one of the first things I was willing to sacrifice, but I was not willing to ever sacrifice 400 as the only clue. So I just said, well, let's have 400x coming up this column. What does that then mean? It means that at the top of this column, there's an implied 400x with this cell in the first column of the second row and this cell in the second column of the first row being the same number, and how that works out. And I already have one of those values set, which is 5 times 80. I don't have the other set, but this is at least a place to get some work going forward. I also now have made a lot of progress in the 7th column, so I was trying to now think through what can I do with that. I have 5, 16, 25, 100, 200, so the 100, 200 crook was ready to kind of think about right now, and I almost half sketched it in the bottom. 1625 is going to be some pair of a product, which means I can place a 5 in any single cell I want, particularly in the 3rd, 7th, or I guess 5th rows. Here I was trying in the 5th row, but I'm still like thinking through where this is a kind of step I can put into the grid. Where does the 100 and 200 do more for me? And that's where, looking at the notes I had to the right and still think I was going to be building a frame sort of design where like frame, 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 I put the 100, 200 in the upper right, was pretty comfortable with that because of how it's going to interact with the clues further to the right. I had 2 options for the 5, 16, 25, and again I can put the 5 very cleanly in the 5th row or the 7th row. And here I paused a bit and wanted to say, is there some other way I can give a solver a break into the digit set? And again, one of the things I hope people saw from the digit set is that the 1 and 400 values were eliminated, which meant that the smallest numbers you can be using are 2, 4, and 5. And so I wondered, can I make a very, very big product that would actually work for a 2, 4, 5 option in some way? And so what you'll see me marking out is a 2 times 4 times 5, which is 40, plus another 2 times 5 gets me to 400. So there's a 5-cell 400 cage, which is what I actually intended to then be the break-in for the whole grid to figure out the actual number set. It wasn't that magic just with the bottom row. At least this was a backup plan. I wanted to always make this be an accessible puzzle, and so having a few routes to a hard deduction is a better thing than having one route to an impossible deduction. Your solvers get stuck. And so seeing that, I need to get 5, 2, and 4 in one long row. And if 5 was in the bottom spot pointing into those 2, 4 on this 400x clue, that wasn't going to work. So the 5 had to be in the 5th row, 16, 25 down below. I wrote the 2-4 to the left, and now I have, and I had this sort of in my notes, like the 2-5 can come up or come down, but in the next adjacent row, the 4 for the 6 is where the remaining 2 and 5 are going to go. And so I was still like thinking really about the 5-2-4, but then I'm going to shift my thinking back to the 2 and the 5 and say, where do I get more placements and quickly? It's going to be moving the 2 down. So the 2-5 are down in this row. There's going to be a pointing pair straight at that 2-4 note. And so just as solvers would run into these deductions flow in this order because I was very much like writing the grid in this order. And that's one of the I guess, long-term stories about the art of puzzle crafting is to make these work. So let me sort of pause before I go too fast here. Now I've actually marked a lot of 2s and 4s in the grid, and I had mentally mapped this leftmost column as having 400 times as the only kinds of clues working there. But now I've got all these 2s, some of these 4s, actually 4s in all of the rows that point to this 400x clue. I now have a lot of constraints on what pairs can still go in those spaces. And so this is what you'll see me kind of transitioning to as I'm solving. I'm sort of quickly jumping over to consider what's true in the left column. 4 to 100 is out, 200 is out. So there actually is now a single pair that's left that's in the digit space because of how the 2s and 4s fully point to the left and eliminate all that stuff. Even going further up, these 200s in the space eliminate the 100 from this option. So this will have to be 200 here, as you'll see me write soon. I already started by writing the 100 up at the top. And actually where it's 200 there, the 200 on the right side actually forces the 200 on the left side. And it now gives me an 80-16 pair as well as a 100-200 pair for the other spots in that grid. Where 4 and 100 are the last spots, but I already have 100 in the grid. I get those in. So this is really good progress. You always feel lucky when you get these dominoes happen. There's no reason why I was constructing the puzzle. I know I'd run into these exact dominoes, but I had this as a start to the puzzle. I definitely felt I now wanted to force the top set if I could, and moving the 2-5 over to the right meant 200 is in the top set, 16-25 now in this set. So I would still have some challenges. I need to get a 16-25 in the grid somehow. More forced in placements, but I really constrained the 100s and 200s, so I'm going through and noting where those can go. The number 100 has just 3 more places in the grid to be, but there are lots of flexibility there. There are 3 more 2s to place, and so I guess, well, 5 to place, but the notes in the 2nd through 4th column are what I'm putting in. 200 is actually one worth looking at, and that's because in the bottommost 2 rows, it really only has 2 spots that can go. The one I just marked in, I guess one I'm going to come back to in a bit to mark in, and then there are 3 options in the 5th row and 6th row, but they form a set with the top pair, which is what eliminates it down below. So you can see those 200s is now an interesting next point of tension to think through in constructing this grid, as well as maybe some of the things will play out into the 6th row just above. And so this is where I got 80, 100, 200 that are going there. And the 100 has just 2 options for it, and the 80 pointing up is something I'm thinking about. And I'm coming back to one of my things. The starting theme for this puzzle are these magic sums, including one that will have 80 in it. And so I said, well, maybe there's a way in the sum that I don't want to have 200s and 200 get too large. I can make the sum have to take that 80, again, a 5-cell sum. That would move the 100 to the right, move the 200 to the left. So my idea was to see if I could force this to work. One thing for sure that's going to do is force the 200 to not be in that sum. And it also meant I needed to have the 5 and 25 not in the sum, just as I had before in all these other places it appears. And so like that sort of thing is what I'm writing on the side. I'm feeling pretty brilliant. I come into this step and see sort of 2, 4, all these sort of things play out. Here's a place I wish, like, you know, given this puzzle is a pretty nice puzzle, I wish I actually had done this right. Like if I pause here, like this is a case when you're constructing a puzzle, you can really screw up. Again, like 5 and 25 are the digits, or sorry, numbers that I said I'd be excluding. And notice like a solver who's solving too fast. What do I write? I put 16 down below. I don't put 25 down below. And so I've just broken my grid at this stage of the puzzle. Again, like everything up to this stage is fine, but that second when I'm writing 16 there, I've left myself with no world where in the next few minutes of this video I'm getting to a valid solution. Although I do get to a solution, but then if you look back at it, this is not 400 plus, this is something else. And so I'm gonna like pause the story here and jump to the restart, sort of try to, like when going through this puzzle of like how to make this work. And it's not to say like, you know, constructors are brilliant, but even brilliant people make some errors. This is sort of the try to on the same grid. 25 coming down, forcing that 25-16. Apologies, some of the erasures, other stuff, there were probably some notes that didn't carry fully across, but a lot of the shape of what was already there is still preserved in this grid for sure. We now have 200 limited to 2 options there, as well as 2 options right at the top. The value of 80 is split across those cells, so there is, again, some good structure coming into that 5th row because of what we've made as progress in the 6th row. Marking some other notes back, the 80s is 2 options there. I think I'll put the 416 back in the 7th row next, and I can make the playback speed a little faster here. One of the things for sure is figuring out, is there a way to force that 200 that's now hanging in the 5th row, because that's going to force the topmost pair, that 202 pair, and it's probably going to force something around these 2s. So these 2s are another tension point. They're now just these 3 to place for sure, and they're in the places where my notes live. And so a question I was asking myself at this stage is there something to do right around here to make this forced? And that could be coming up this channel or coming up that channel, but doing something that would eliminate 200 potentially is an option. And one thing I had in mind, it would be a cool deduction, is to put something that looks on a surface very, very valid. Like, let's put 400 times as a product coming up here. 200 times 2, valid on its own. 80 times 5, valid on its own. 25 times 16, valid on its own. All 3 of those options still work here, except for the fact 200 is up at the top. And so 200 can't be here and also here in the other direction, the orthogonal direction. So my sense of not giving the solver too much, but giving them just enough to, sort of work through, is to put a 400x in one of those 2 spaces. I put it on the 4th column, not the 3rd column first, but figured that 400, 200 would put this node in. It now means that just that 5 and 16 are left over, which means the 2 is going to have to go to the left, and the other 2 is going to have to be in the top of the 4th column in the 2nd row. And this is a good place to kind of pause and say this was the next place I felt I'd made a lot of headway, but I now had different options to try to make this work out to be a unique grid. And this is one of the ways when you really work through a puzzle, you'll try some stuff and it won't work. And so I'll get to maybe sort of this story as like on the 2nd attempt, but there are some other forced digits at this moment. Some of them that I've marked in, actually these 5s are what I was thinking a lot about. And working through them, there's now like 3 more 5s to place. They're going to stretch across those notated rows. Is there some kind of product or other clue in that would move them around? And here's one where I could say, well, what if I put in a product that didn't have the value for 5? Again, 80 is right below in that column. Put these in, and you'll run into places where you've now, like, you haven't detected all the constraints your puzzle has, but in this case, the constraint is you can't have that many 16s in this space. 1625 replicated in 2 spots would actually require 4 16s across these 3 columns, so I can't fill in this cell. 1616 would duplicate up, and everything else here is forced. And so this is a kind of example of a place where you sometimes want to step back, even grab a new sheet of paper and review your constraints. And so I'm going to sort of jump to that. What I did at this stage was take the stage of my solved puzzle on the left, and I have sort of boxed in at least that one of these rectangles is a box I'm thinking a lot about. This has constraints I have to think through in here, but convert this to a standard Latin square, and then just even go through. There are some different software tools I'll sometimes use, not to write the puzzle, but to check things about the puzzle. In this case, I think this has roughly 30. I don't know if the exact number is like 27 or 36, but it has roughly 30 solutions still. And so I wasn't in a place where I had no possible solutions, but I was in a place like if I made this be 15 and 16, or in this language, this would be 4, 5, basically 2 equaled 1, 4 equaled 2, 5 equaled 3. This is just like the numbers as they grew in size. That wouldn't work. So there are reasons that this group having to be a group over here that was limiting me to only like a few dozen, 2 dozen, 24 of those 30 plus solutions. And in doing that, I still wanted to think back, how could I quickly force all of the rest to happen? And so I came back to my thinking about where can I place a crooked clue, which would be 4, 4, 25 or 5, 5, 16 somewhere into the grid. And that's what I kind of refresh as I come back to this video and sort of work through sort of what to do. There's kind of a mental pause here, but the pause is going to be reset as I come in and mark one of the spots I found, which was, again, like grasp that top 5 and think that you have to take another 5 and don't want to kind of quickly write it in. For sure, this is a 5 times 80. And actually, I probably don't even know it's in one of those 2 cells. But 5 with 80 left over has to be 5 and 16. There's no other 2 numbers that work, and that's what I'm confirming for myself now. And so this has to be that 5, 5, 16 crook. Puts in a 5 and an 80, moves that 80 over. It completes the 4, 16 pairs that we had before. It's going to give me some 25. And so this looks like good progress. I didn't know if this would take me all the way to 1 solution. Actually, I did know from looking at the lattice square, this would still leave me with 2 solutions. but it's pretty easy when you've got two solutions to figure out a last cage to fix it down. And so I was pretty comfortable that this would resolve in a clean way. And seeing a 25 next to an 80 or 16 option, I said, I'll just make that another product. There's not a lot in the grid that forces the 25s and 16s, so I don't think this was going to put an earlier break-in into the grid. It is going to be a good break-in at this stage to complete the puzzle. And so that's sort of the visual story of me constructing this puzzle, as well as a lot of the backing before it. This is not the final version of the puzzle you would have seen. In part, I still had some choices of the visual representation of the grid, including I could permute sets of rows or columns or other things. So I did think about the left-right shift, where it started with a frame, thinking in mind that I actually had this empty digit in the second row of the first column. That was a digit I didn't necessarily want to be in that spot. So I did reflect the second through eighth columns fully, and so made that as this puzzle. This is my own sort of solver's version. You write a puzzle, you test it again from scratch. So I was testing it from scratch, assuming and testing all the things I hadn't thought about, like even you can see this 2525 248 note again. I then sent it to others to keep testing, and initially felt this might be a 4 or 4.5 star puzzle. It tested harder than we wanted, but it didn't test impossibly hard. A lot of solvers loved it. It didn't seem I'd hit the goals I had for it. So a lot goes into writing these puzzles, not as much as his 400th puzzle, but for Milestones you pull out some extra stops. But I hope you got a good sense through this video of the context that goes in before you start writing a grid, as you're writing a grid, and then even after you're writing the grid, of the changes to really polish a puzzle. That's the art of puzzle crafting. This will be the first of many more examples for me, but hope you enjoyed the video. Like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.